Good day, everyone. We are here to discuss the utilitarianism. What is utilitarianism? It is the idea that the right thing to do is whatever brings the most happiness to the most people. So, before we start our introduction, let us all watch this video.
Hi, I'm Julia Markovits, and I'm an associate professor of philosophy at MIT. Today, I'm going to talk about utilitarianism. So I spend my time thinking about morality, about what makes actions morally right or morally wrong, and I wanted to talk today about a very simple, quite popular answer to that question, a moral theory that goes by the name utilitarianism. Utilitarianism has a lot going for it, but it also raises some very interesting worries, and I'm going to talk a bit about some of those. So utilitarianism is the view that actions are morally permissible if and only if they produce at least as much net happiness as any other available action. In other words, the more happiness and less suffering that results from our actions, the better the action is. And the right action is the one that produces the greatest balance of happiness over suffering. In fact, according to utilitarianism, any other action is morally wrong. This utilitarian principle is supposed to be absolute and all-encompassing. It will tell you for any decision whatsoever exactly what you should morally do, and it admits of no exceptions. Utilitarianism has been around for a long time, but it gained a lot in prominence and popularity in the late 18th century, due in part to the work of a British philosopher named Jeremy Bentham. Bentham published a long defense of utilitarianism called An Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation in 1789, but he was also a very politically and socially active guy. In fact, he was an early defender of economic liberalization, freedom of expression, the separation of church and state, women's rights, animal rights, the right to divorce, the abolition of slavery, the abolition of capital punishment, the abolition of corporal punishment, prison reform, and even the decriminalization of homosexual acts. Remember, this was 1789. Bentham recognized the moral importance of these rights, many of which are now uncontroversial. In this, he was well ahead of his time, and in large part, I would think, because of his embrace of utilitarianism. That, for me, counts heavily in favor of it as a moral theory. And in fact, aspects of utilitarianism can look very hard to resist. We can break the utilitarian thesis up into two parts: a theory of what is valuable and a theory of right action, given what's valuable. First, the theory of what's valuable. It says that the only thing that's valuable in its own right is happiness and the absence of suffering. Other things, like money, might be derivatively valuable because it helps us get happiness. Second, the theory of right action. The right action is the one that maximizes, produces the most of what's valuable, or if that's uncertain, that produces the most expected value. If you put those two pieces, the theory of what's valuable and the theory of right action given what's valuable, together, you get utilitarianism. Here's a very simple example. Let's say I'm a doctor and I have only 5 doses left of some very scarce medicine. In an emergency situation, I'm left with 6 patients, all of whom need the drug to survive. But one of them, let's call her needy, will survive only if I give her all 5 doses of the drug. The other 5 patients can survive on a single dose each, and we can assume that I know nothing else about these patients. Utilitarianism will tell us to divide up the drug, saving the 5 and allowing needy to die. Why? Because saving the 5 lives preserves much more happiness and prevents much more suffering than saving just 1 life. And in that case, that seems like the right answer. It's important to notice that these two elements of utilitarianism can be separated. We can accept the utilitarian view of what's valuable without embracing its claim about what that means for how we should act. And we can accept the utilitarian claim that the right action is the one that makes the most value without accepting the claim that happiness and the absence of suffering are all that's valuable.
Utilitarianism ethics, maximizing happiness and minimizing suffering. In this discussion, we're going to explore the principles, type, advantages, challenges, and real-life example of utilitarianism ethics, a fascinating ethical theory. Utilitarianism is an ethical theory that centers on the principle of maximizing overall happiness and minimizing suffering as the ultimate measure of morality. Developed by philosophers such as Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, utilitarianism is a fundamentally consequentialist, asserting that the rightness or wrongness of an action is determined by its outcome. The core idea is encapsulated in the greatest happiness principle, which protests that individuals should strive to bring about the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of beings. In the practical terms, this means evaluating the consequences of action and choosing those that lead to the greatest overall well-being. For instance, in a utilitarian framework, a decision to allocate resources to the social welfare program rather than a luxury project is justified if it results in the higher net increase in happiness by improving the life of a larger number of people. Utilitarianism emphasizes on the consequences of action, and the pursuit of collective well-being make it consequentialist ethical theory with a broad application in various moral and practical domains. There are three types of principles of utilitarianism ethic. First is the greatest happiness principle, second hedonistic calculus, third act versus rule. Greatest happiness principle is a core tenet of utilitarianism, asserting that the moral value of an action is determined by its ability to produce the greatest overall happiness or pleasure while minimizing suffering. Proposed by Jeremy Bentham and later refined by John Stuart Mill. This principle underscored the consequentialist nature of utilitarian ethics. It requires individuals to consider the well-being of all beings and make choices that lead to the greatest collective happiness. The principle acknowledges that happiness can take various forms, including intellectual, emotional, and physical well-being, and encouraged a holistic evaluation of the consequences of action on the overall quality of life. The second is hedonistic calculus. The hedonistic calculus is a concept introduced by Jeremy Bentham, serving as a method for quantifying pleasure and pain to determine the moral value of action within utilitarianism. This calculus involves considering several factors, including intensity, duration, certainty, propinquity, fecundity, priority, and extent. When assessing the consequences of an action, each factor contributes to the overall calculation of happiness, with the goal of guiding individuals towards action that result in the greatest net pleasure and the less amount of pain. The hedonistic calculus provides an systematic framework for evaluating the consequences of action and aims to to bring a degree of objectivity to the inherently subjective task of measuring happiness and suffering. The third of principles of utilitarianism ethic is the act versus rule. The act versus rule, the distinction between act and rule utilitarianism revolves around the scope of ethical evaluation. Act utilitarianism assesses the morality of individual action, suggesting that the right action is in a specific situation is the one that maximizes overall happiness. In contrast, the role utilitarianism focuses on the establishment and adherence to moral rules or principles that, when universal follow, lead to the greatest overall happiness. While act utilitarianism allow for flexibility in decision making based on the particular circumstances, rule utilitarianism seek to provide general guidelines that, if consistent, follow contribute to the overall well-being of society. The debate between the two lies in how best to balance the need for flexibility in ethical decision making with the desire for clear and constant moral principle.
So we now head on to the types of utilitarianism ethics. So we have here three types of utilitarianism. So firstly is we have act utilitarianism, role utilitarianism, and preference utilitarianism. So what is the act of utilitarianism? So it is a form of its utilitarian ethics that evaluates the morality of individuals' actions based on their specific consequences. According to act utilitarianism, it is the right action in a given situation is the one that produces the greatest overall happiness. For example, if a doctor has a patient in critical condition and has to decide between two treatment options, utilitarianism would recommend that option that maximizes the patient's well-being even if involves the breaking rule of norm in a specific medical context. And we have the role utilitarianism. So it is a contrast to connect to act utilitarianism. It focuses on the consequences of adapting the following specific rules or morals principles. It suggests that moral rules should be established based on whether they lead to greater overall happiness than universally applied. For instance, in the realm of criminal justice, rule utilitarianism might argue for the establishment and adherence to a legal system that generally forbids theft, as the widespread acceptance of such a rule tends to promote social trust and well-being. So we also have, lastly, the preference utilitarianism. So the preference utilitarianism evaluates the morality of actions based on the satisfaction of individuals. Preference for or desires, it considers the fulfillment of preferences as a key component of overall happiness. For example, in economic policy, preference utilitarianism might guide decision makers to prioritize policies that align with the preferences of the majority, such as providing a range of public services, as this would contribute to the overall satisfaction and well-being of the population. So each type of utilitarianism provides a slightly different perspective on how to maximize overall happiness, with act utilitarianism focusing on individual actions, role utilitarianism emphasizing the importance of following moral rules, and preference utilitarianism the ful- considers the fulfillment of individual preferences as essential to the ethical evaluation of actions. So next is we have the challenges and criticisms of utilitarianism ethics. So we have actually three here. So we have the egalitarian critic. We also have the measurement issues and moral worthiness. Utilitarianism's consequential focus is a distinctive advantage as it directs moral assessment based on the outcomes of actions. prioritizing the overall well-being of individuals. For instance, in environmental decision making, a utilitarian approach might consider the consequences of a proposed environment impact with the aim of maximizing the collective happiness of the affected communities. The flexibility inherent in utilitarianism is another strength, allowing the nuanced evaluations in diverse scarce medical resources. A utilitarianism perspective permits the adaptability, as decisions can be tailored to prioritize those interventions that promise the greatest overall increase in well-being or life expectancy. Furthermore, the efficiency of utilitarianism lies in its pragmatic focus on maximizing happiness, providing a straightforward criterion for decision making, considers a scenario in business ethics where a company is contemplating a cost-cutting measure. Utilitarianism would assess the efficiency of this decision making by weighing the overall positive outcomes, such as financial stability and continued employment for many, against potential negative consequences, such as job losses for a few, to determine the course of action that optimizes overall well being.
Okay, so we have here challenges and criticisms of utilitarianism ethics. We have three here: egalitarian critic, measurement issues, moral blameworthiness. Let's start with the egalitarian critic. Utilitarianism faces criticisms from the egalitarian perspective, which argues that the theory may not adequately address issues of justice and fairness. Critics contend that utilitarianism could in some cases justify actions that result in unequal distribution of happiness, potentially neglecting the well-being of marginalized or disadvantaged individuals. For example, if a policy leads to overall happiness but disappointment benefits that affluent while worsening the conditions for the less privileged, the egalitarian pursue would argue that this outcome is morally problematic, highlighting a tension between utilitarian principles and the pursuit of social justice. So moving on in the second, measurement issues. Utilitarianism's Utilitarianism relies on the quantification of happiness or pleasure, posing challenges in accurately measuring and comparing the well-being of individuals. The subjective nature of happiness and the diversity of inferences makes it difficult to develop a universal scale for measuring pleasure and pain. For instance, determining the overall happiness resulting from a healthcare policy might involve complex considerations, including physical health, mental well-being, and personal satisfaction. The lack of precise and objective measurement tool makes it challenging to apply utilitarianism consistently across different contexts and assess the true consequences of action. Lastly, we have moral blameworthiness. Critics argue that utilitarianism might not adequately account for individual moral blameworthiness, as the theory primarily focuses on outcomes rather than intentions. In situations where individuals make morally wrong decisions but unintentionally produce positive consequences, utilitarianism may struggle to assign moral responsibility. For instance, if a doctor administers the wrong medication but by chance it improves the patient's condition, utilitarianism might endorse the action based on its positive consequences while potentially overlooking the moral capability of the doctor for making an error decision. This criticism highlights a tension between consequentialist ethics and the traditional emphasis on intentions and personal responsibility in moral evaluation. So let's move on to the real life examples of utilitarianism ethics in action. So first we have here economic policies. So utilitarianism can influence economic policies by emphasizing the maximization of overall well-being. For example, a government implementing progressive taxation to fund social welfare programs can be viewed through a utilitarian lens. By redistributing wealth, such policies aim to reduce economic inequality, potentially increasing overall happiness by providing essential services to those in need. Utilitarianism judges decision makers to weigh the positive impact on the less affluent, who may experience an improvement in their quality of life, against the potential negative consequences for the wealthier individuals facing higher taxes. Second, we have here public health interventions. Utilitarian principles often play a role in shaping public health interventions, with a focus on minimizing harm and maximizing well-being for the entire population. Vaccination programs provide a clear example. They aim to prevent the spread of infectious diseases and protect the overall health and communities. Utilitarianism supports those interventions by evaluating the consequences of widespread vaccinations and considering the reduction in disease prevalence, lower healthcare costs, and improve overall well-being as positive outcomes, even if a small number of individuals may experience minor side effects. Thirdly, we have here environmental conservation. Utilitarianism can guide decisions in environmental conservation efforts by assessing the impact on the well-being of present and future generations. For instance, or for example, implementing stricter regulation on industrial emissions to combat air pollution aligns with utilitarian principles. While industries might incur additional costs for compliance, the overall benefits include improved air quality, reduced health risk, and the preservation of ecosystem. Utilitarianism supports each measures by emphasizing the net positive consequences for the broader population and environment, contributing to long-term sustainable well-being. And lastly, last slide, we have your conclusion and takeaways. So what do we get in this utilitarianism? Utilitarianism ethics provides a consequentialist approach to decision making, aiming to maximize overall happiness while considering the potential challenges and criticisms. It offers valuable insights into various aspects of human life. So meaning you are you are prioritizing the well-being of the uh, the majority over the minority. So that's all I think. And let me, if you are still in confused, let me watch, let me play this video for you.
Utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is an ethical theory that determines right from wrong by focusing on outcomes. It is a form of consequentialism. Utilitarianism holds that the most ethical choice is the one that will produce the greatest good for the greatest number. It is the only moral framework that can be used to justify military force or war. It is also the most common approach to moral reasoning used in business because of the way in which it accounts for costs and benefits. However, because we cannot predict the future, it's difficult to know with certainty whether the consequences of our actions will be good or bad. This is one of the limitations of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism also has trouble accounting for values such as justice and individual rights. For example, assume a hospital has 4 people whose lives depend upon receiving organ transplants: a heart, lungs, a kidney, and a liver. If a healthy person wanders into the hospital, his organs could be harvested to save 4 lives at the expense of 1 life. This would arguably produce the greatest good for the greatest number, but few would consider it an acceptable course of action, let alone the most ethical one. So, although utilitarianism is arguably the most reason-based approach to determining right and wrong, it has obvious limitations.
So, as you noticed, this video is quite similar to the first one. It examples the hospital produce greatest good for the greatest number. And with that, I hope you understand something in our discussion. Goodbye.